Thanks, Andrew. Rauranga tira mā, tēnei te mihi nui, kia koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, everyone. My background is in commercial law and strategy, and an even longer background in carbon markets and climate change policy. So it's quite hard to believe that I now find myself in banking, of all places, and at the heart of the hottest trend in finance, being sustainable finance. But it's the right place to be, as it brings together many of the things that we at Westpac care about, talking to our customers every day about how climate risk is business risk, and how we can help them navigate their way through this operating environment, maximise their opportunities for stakeholder engagement and innovation, and finance their transition. Firstly, a few parallels with COVID-19 and climate change. The lockdowns in 2020 taught us that when we listen to science, we can make informed decisions which may create some short, sharp economic pain, but will result in medium, longer-term benefits to society and the economy. The lockdowns also highlighted the extent of our interconnectedness with nature in a way that many of us might not previously have been aware, that we're an inherent part of Earth's living systems. We depend entirely on it for survival. We exist in a pretty narrow environmental niche, the Goldilocks zone, if you like, not too hot, not too cold. We need certain amounts of rainfall to grow, and we like that food to grow food, and we like that food to be high in protein. We need clean air and the thriving, biodiverse ecosystems that make our lives possible. But outside of these limits, we struggle. And as New Zealand found with COVID-19, fast action now is way more cost-effective than paying later for the consequences of not acting. And the same mindset applies in relation to climate change. And despite the uncertainty of 2020, people are still focused on climate action. At the large climate change and sustainable finance events that have all been squeezed into this month, we've not once heard that climate change priorities should be shelved until we've managed the economic consequences of COVID-19. And this, I think, is in part because the pandemic has sharpened people's minds on the need to better manage our interrelationship with nature, the biggest of which is climate change. And it's this mindset that's going to help us determine what to build and how. In economics, there's a phrase called path dependency. And this means that when you embark on a path, for example, everyone's going to travel to work in a car. So you build bigger and better roads. And it turns out 50 or 100 years into that, you realise that isn't actually the smartest, fastest, or cheapest way to get into work. But now we're on that path, and it's very difficult to switch from one path to another. You've got locked-in capital and locked-in long-term contracts. You've got vested interests, car makers, car lovers, petrol importers, road engineers, and so on. And perhaps you haven't properly positioned alternatives to offer a viable solution, rail, bike lanes. So if you want to get out of a path-dependent system, you need to disrupt that system. And you in the room today have the ability to do that. Looking at the roles of the 860 delegates at this conference, every single one here today has a role to remove the country from a path dependency on fossil fuels and high energy using systems and structures that will not withstand climate change. Excuse me, this room's 16 degrees. To create a thriving, resilient and net zero emissions economy, we will have to shift our focus to building productive and sustainable systems that nest within the Earth system, of which we're an inherent part. So now we're just going to look a little bit more at climate risk and why it is business risk, and then at the role that infrastructure and ultimately finance can play in creating a better and more viable future for New Zealand. Now, Dr. Vodka has stolen some of my points, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of the key ones. Starting off with the macro lens, in the last 100 years, our climate, as Dr. Carr said, has already warmed 1 degree, and we're currently on track for 3 to 4 degrees. And given, as you may recall, he said in 300 million years, the planet has never operated above 2, we don't really know what 2 degrees looks like. And the simplest way I could think of conveying it to you today was something that was said by a professor at Exeter University, who said that for each 1 degree rise, 1 billion people will be forced to live in conditions that we today consider uninhabitable. So think Sahara, but hotter and drier. And the authors of that study, who've been studying climate change for quite a long time, said they were floored and blown away by the findings. They hadn't expected our species to be quite so vulnerable. So perhaps instead of thinking of climate change as a problem of physics or economics, maybe it's a problem of human habitat. Maybe this isn't a climate emergency, it's a humanity emergency. And just to scare you a little more, we have increasing evidence that we're rapidly moving away from the safe operating space for humanity on Earth because the climate has reached a global crisis point. We're close to crossing what are known as tipping points that will shift the planet to start actually working against us and amplifying the heat. Because the biophysical systems that have a function of regulating our climate are moving and shifting in a way that no longer enables them to perform those functions. So we're pressing unstoppable buttons in the Earth's systems. Therefore, to Rod's point, the next 10 years to 2030 is where we must see the most profound transformation the world has probably ever known. And the countdown has started. It's really simple maths. We need to halve our emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2050, ideally sooner. So what does all this big macro stuff mean for New Zealand? Again, I'm sure he saw my speech before he spoke. As Dr. Vodka mentioned this morning, the Ministry for the Environment in August presented the findings of New Zealand's first National Climate Change Risk Assessment. And I'd echo the same sentiment. Read this if you are involved in planning, investing in, advising on, building or owning infrastructure in New Zealand. Local Government New Zealand estimated a couple of years ago that the total value of all infrastructure assets at risk from sea level rise is between 8 and 13 billion New Zealand dollars. And climate risk is so much more than just sea level rise, so that number is massively bigger. It's also about how and whether we can live with the extreme weather and the changes in rainfall and temperature and the flow-on effects of that. And if you have a look even at the summary of that risk assessment, there are some pretty key questions that leap out to you. Is there water that we can actually drink in a 2-degree world? Can our infrastructure manage the waste and stormwater impacts? How do communities remain connected when displaced? Can the country's agricultural sector produce food at above 2 degrees? And can existing buildings handle the extreme winds and storms, and our existing infrastructure withstand all these impacts? Basically, did we build the right stuff? So the counterfactual of the world not hitting 1.5 degrees target doesn't look good for New Zealand at all. Every sector is affected by climate change, and therefore all businesses need to play their part in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, what is called mitigation, and responding to climate change, i.e. adaptation. So how does this climate risk, translate into risk for business? The context for business risk has been materially altered by climate change. Firstly, there's been a shift in focus from shareholders to stakeholders and the role of business. At Westpac's recent Sustainable Finance Summit earlier this month, Rob Campbell said capitalism remains, but shareholder primacy is shifting to stakeholder capitalism. And stakeholders aren't just your shareholders, they're your customers, your employees, your suppliers, and your supply chain, and the communities in which you operate. They are more empowered and more informed, and they need to be kept happy because that social license is a privilege. We rightly focus on physical and transition risks associated with climate change, but reputational risks are equally important. Consumer activism on climate change is on the rise, particularly among a new generation of consumers and investors. So if you're ignoring climate change in your future infrastructure plans, you are at risk of being stranded with assets of no use and of no customers. Secondly, there's also been a change in the dialogue around climate change globally and locally. There are now real-world legal and economic implications for those who don't manage climate risk and start their transition. Litigation risks associated with inaction are likely to become more prominent. And there'll be an inability to build plans flowing from decisions that are blind to climate risk. And the best example there is how the third runway at Heathrow was stymied when the Court of Appeal in England found that the UK government acted unlawfully in failing to consider its obligations under the Paris Agreement on climate change. It said the government's actions were irrational and unlawful. Decision makers across the economy will need to be conscious of these potential consequences when considering infrastructure projects in the future. And thirdly, the government is shaping the context around climate change by increasing the amount of information available to investors, analysts, customers, regulators, employees, and communities. In the next 2 years, government is mandating climate risk disclosure by over 200 listed issuers, banks, asset managers, and insurers, who will soon be required to undertake formal climate risk reporting on a comply or explain basis. Many large businesses in New Zealand don't currently have a good understanding of how climate change will impact what they do. And mandated climate risk reporting will massively change this. And in some cases, the emperor will have no clothes. Chapman Tripp, in their toolkit on climate risk for directors, said something very simple that I think is a great takeaway here. Management of climate risk is not about compliance. Understanding climate risk is key to mid to long-term strategy and resilience. So managing your climate risk is really just now good business. So what does this mean for infrastructure and for you in the room? It means decarbonising every aspect of our lives and the big systems that run our lives that everyone in this room is a part of. Energy, transport, industry, buildings, agriculture, from being a source of emissions to being a store of carbon, and protecting the natural ecosystems that help us store carbon. Infrastructure, particularly for the energy and water and transport sectors, has a long lead time, so it needs to be in the right place in 50, 80 or 100 years. And it needs to be climate resilient. So it needs to either reduce emissions or enable New Zealand to adapt to climate change, or ideally both. And also we have to take societal needs into account too. Does the infrastructure create jobs? Does it help reduce social inequality? Are there some triple wins to be gained there? What we build matters for the long term and influences the decisions of generations to come. And if we approach these crises with the right mindset, then our responses can open up real opportunities to create long-term sustainable value for future generations. And business risk affects returns as well, but also creates investment opportunities. There's an increasing recognition by the capital markets that climate risk is business risk. The core function of the capital markets is to evaluate and price risk. And capital then flows to where it can earn the highest risk-adjusted return over time. So if we properly evaluate and account for the benefits and costs of climate change, then a strong investment case can be made to invest in sustainable infrastructure. And leadership matters, and business can work faster than government on climate change and needs to. From a policy perspective, as we heard James Shaw say last week, the last 3 years have really involved setting up a lot of frameworks, architecture and institutions. The Zero Carbon Bill, putting a cap on our cap and trade scheme, the Climate Change Commission, the Green Investment Fund, and mandating climate risk reporting. But we haven't actually cut any emissions yet. In fact, we're on track not only to not hit our Paris Agreement targets, but to actually increase our emissions. The climate change budgets that Dr. Rodkar mentioned earlier next year will help set up the right policy environments for business to respond, and key sector-based signals will flow from these. But don't wait for those. Smart businesses are increasingly focusing on climate change and on their broader sustainability issues. We're seeing sustainability strategies and corporate strategies aligning, singing off the same song sheet, as it were. Many businesses are not waiting for the regulation, as the other drivers that we've spoken about are making them act sooner. Climate and temperature change predictions, resulting weather and economic impacts, legal, financial, stakeholder risks, and disclosure. It's a pretty compelling list. The public and the private sectors are collaborating more, as Rod said, seek out partners, and data is increasingly informing decision on where the spend needs to occur. And to touch on something highlighted by Laura just then, nature-based solutions have a role to play as well. They represent a new framing of our relationship with nature and be quite a powerful ally in the battle against climate change. For example, protecting wetlands can secure and regulate water supply. New ecosystems in cities can help with cooling, flood abatement, reduce air pollution, and provide mental and physical health benefits. And many other cities have done this, so we can follow suit here. Some interesting examples: climate tiles in Denmark are a form of pavement that protects against increased rainfall, taking the load off the roads and the sewer system. Portland and Oregon invested $9 million in green infrastructure and has since found the initiatives have saved $224 million in sewer outflow costs. And just last night, I spoke to somebody from a local council who has 6 options for replacement of their wastewater system. And the natural option of using wetlands as part of the solution is by far the cheapest, and it doesn't tie up otherwise productive land. We talk a lot to our customers about climate risk, as understanding the impact that climate change can have on your strategy is common sense. And my suggestion is don't wait for government-mandated disclosure requirements, get going now. You can look into the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It's all open source, it's easy to find. You can review other climate risk disclosure statements, some great examples of those, Meridian and Orion. You can ensure you have in place on the board or in the senior leadership or in your advisor group the right expertise. So if you are an advisor on infrastructure, and most of you are, get up to speed on climate risk and bring that knowledge into your customer conversations. Identify and engage with all of your stakeholders, particularly your consumers and your supply chain. Explore whether your emissions trajectory is aligned to a 1.5 degree pathway or goes wildly beyond it. And consider the actions that your company could take now to reduce its exposure to physical, legal, and commercial risks on the horizon from climate change. Soon, Westpac will be disclosing our own climate risk based on our lending portfolio. For as with most companies, climate risk is financial risk. For the last 18 months, we've been exploring the impact of sea level rise on our business. Many homes, commercial properties, and farms have mortgages on them with us. And while insurance is currently widely available, we know that risk-based pricing is coming. So through our lending, we're exposed because our customers' risks are our risks. And that's not just a long-term risk, it's closer than many people think, as climate impacts are becoming increasingly visible and some properties are already objectively uninsurable. And through our work, we've developed a much better understanding of what turns these natural impacts into financial impacts. And that's important because it helps us to respond holistically and strategically. In fact, drilling deeper and analysing what drives the risks provides the kind of insight you need to connect the dots and make those right strategic decisions. For example, Westpac's now going to be paying a lot more attention to resource management legislation, which is not exactly the core competency of a bank. And then lastly, just touching on how to finance that transition. As being from a bank, this is hugely important to us. Banks provide the majority of capital into the New Zealand economy, so we have to take a lead here and align our balance sheets to pressing environmental and social priorities. Climate change is one of the top priorities on our list. The sustainable finance markets are evolving to respond to the changing needs of our customers. 3 years ago, the Sustainable Finance Toolkit really only had green bonds and a handful of social bonds. Now we have sustainability bonds and performance-linked mechanisms, loans where the amount of interest charged by the lender changes based on the performance of material and ambitious sustainability targets. And this structure has been extended into the bond market, not yet in New Zealand, but it will come. Green loans are being increasingly sought by our customers, and transition finance is started to be talked about. That's for those issuers or borrowers who are not natural green bond issuers, as they're large greenhouse gas emitters, but the proceeds of their borrowing are being used to finance or refinance new or existing transition projects, i.e. ones that enable a low carbon performance or substantial emission reductions over a period of time, coal to gas or fuel efficiency. Global markets have really embraced sustainable finance, and New Zealand is following. Since June 2018, there have been 14 sustainable bond issuance by New Zealand issuers, exceeding $5.5 billion. And next year will be a big sustainable debt year for New Zealand, both in bonds and loans. So in summary, COVID-19, climate change does not observe borders, national or physical. And like COVID-19, listening to science and understanding our interconnectedness with nature can de-risk the impacts and create opportunities. These problems can only be managed through collective action that starts long before they become full-blown crises. We're nearing the stage of full-blown crisis with climate change, so climate action by every business is necessary and now. The toolkit we've discussed today is one of many resources there to help you. So school up on the climate risks to your business and engage in the work of the Climate Commission starting on 1 February next year. And at Westpac, we would love to help you plan, invest in, advise on, build or own infrastructure that sits at the heart of clean technology, positive health and societal outcomes, increased economic value and resilience to climate change, and then together, as a country, we can succeed. The pandemic has revealed that overnight, transformational change is possible. A different world and a different economy is dawning. What role will the infrastructure that you play? Thank you.